From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Torello. I'm on staff with the Kluge Center. Welcome to our program today. Before we begin, I want to remind you to please turn off any cell phones or other electronic devices that might interfere with the program. I also want to remind you that we're filming today's lecture for a presentation on our website and our YouTube and iTunes channels. This afternoon's program is being presented by the John W. Kluge Center. The Kluge Center is a vibrant community of scholars on Capitol Hill. We bring together researchers from around the world to energize one another, to use the library's rich collections, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for scholars at every level, from the senior scholars to our postdoctoral fellows, to PhD candidates, and we are grateful for this rich and enlivening community. We're happy to have Sarah Cameron back with us today. Dr. Cameron was a Kluge Fellow earlier in the year, and the title of her lecture today will be The Hungry Steppe: Famine, Violence, and the Making of Soviet Kazakhstan. While she was here at the library, Dr. Cameron analyzed a little-known episode of Stalinist social engineering. It was a tragic event, the Kazakh famine of 1930 to 1933, which led to the death of more than 1.5 million people, which was close to a quarter of Soviet Kazakhstan's population. And today, Dr. Cameron will be using memoirs, oral history accounts, archival documents to explore the stories of those who lived through the famine, asking how this crisis reshaped Soviet Kazakhstan and what it meant to be Kazakh, and how the case of the Kazakh famine alters understanding of development and nation building under Stalin. Dr. Cameron is assistant professor of history at the University of Maryland. She's a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union, has a particular interest in the societies and cultures of Central Asia. In addition to her Kluge Center fellowship, she's been a fellow at the Rachel Carson Center for the Environment and Society in Munich and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Her research has been supported by the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, ACLS Mellon, Fulbright, and others. She received her PhD from Yale University, where her dissertation won the John Addison Porter Prize for the best dissertation in the arts and sciences, and the Turner Prize for the most outstanding dissertation in European history. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Cameron. She'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a time of Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Can all of you hear me okay? Okay, excellent. It's a great pleasure to speak here today, and it was a great pleasure to be a fellow at the Kluge Center from January through July of this past year. I have many thank yous. I'd like to, before I start, I'd like to thank the other fellows that I met along the way for very lively conversations, for making my time here so enjoyable. And in particular, I'd like to thank the entire staff of the Kluge Center, particularly Mary Lou Rieker, Travis Hensley, Jason Steinhauer, and Dan Torello, who were just absolutely wonderful and made my stay here so enjoyable. Finally, I'd like to thank the subject area librarians who went out of their way to track down hard-to-find books and materials in Russian and in Kazakh. I'd particularly like to thank Harry Leik in the European reading room and Joan Weeks in the African and in the Middle East reading room. As I'll detail in my talk today, the books that I found during my stay as a Kluge Fellow greatly enriched my research, and I found actually a number of materials here that I had not found in either Russia or in Kazakhstan. In the early 1990s, Zhe Abishuli spoke about his memories of the Kazakh famine of 1930 to 33, a crisis which transformed the new Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan. I was still a child, but I could not forget this, Abishuli recalled. My bones are shaking as these memories come into my mind. During the famine, activists with the Soviet regime had stripped Abishuli's family of their livestock and grain, and starving people fled in every direction. His father's relatives had fled Soviet Kazakhstan entirely, escaping across the border to China. For those who remained, Abishuli concluded, hunger was, quote, a silent enemy. He remembered the arba, or horse-drawn cart that collected the bodies of the dead and dumped them in mass burial grounds on the outskirts of settlements. Later, during World War II, Abishuli would go on to fight on the front lines for the Red Army. Nonetheless, he concluded, quote, surviving a famine is not less than surviving a war. Another survivor of the Kazakh famine of 1930 to 33, Nursultan Abdhanuli, then a 7-year-old boy, recalled that he had seen several family members die of hunger before his eyes in the fall of 1932. Other relatives, he heard, perished in a mountain valley as they fled across the border from Kazakhstan to Kyrgyzstan. In early 1933, he recalled, the real black clouds of hunger came. Abdhanuli's family moved south to Uzanarash, where his father took a position as the head of a district inspectorate commission. Though Abdhanuli's grandmother had warned him to stay hidden under blankets during the journey, children could be kidnapped and eaten by the starving, Abdhanuli peeked out from underneath, and he saw corpses scattered across the ground, hints of the horrors that lay beyond. As the recollections of these famine survivors reveal, the period 1930 to 33 was a time of almost unimaginable suffering in the Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan. In 1929, Joseph Stalin had launched the first 5-year plan, a radical scheme to help the Soviet Union industrialize, secure control over the food supply, and catch up to the capitalist West. Via collectivization, Moscow sought to bring the food supply, including the production of meat and grain, firmly into the grasp of the state. In the Soviet Union's West, and particularly in places like Ukraine and in the Volga, Don, and Kuban areas of Russia, which had large numbers of peasants, devastating famines broke out, taking millions of lives. But if in the Soviet Union's West, collectivization took the form of a war on peasant life, in Kazakhstan it took the form of a war on nomadic life. Through this project, Moscow sought to eliminate the economic and cultural hallmarks of nomadism, permanently settle the Kazakhs, and integrate them into the collectivist whole. The resultant crisis in Kazakhstan upended lives and families, and it left a devastating trail of sorrow in its wake. Ultimately, by the famine's end in 1934, Moscow succeeded in eliminating nomadism, a goal of the campaign. With their livelihood in ruins, Kazakhs were forced to abandon their nomadic way of nomadism for a settled one. This marked a really profound rupture in this region, the Kazakh steppe. Pastoral nomadism had been the predominant way of life actually for over 4 millennia. It's difficult to determine an exact death toll for the Kazakh famine of 1930 to 33, yet it is clear by any measure that the loss of life was staggering. Out of a total population of 6.5 million people, perhaps 1.5 million people, roughly a quarter of the republic's population, perish in this famine. Decimated by the crisis, Kazakhs actually become a minority in their own Soviet republic. For the remainder of the Soviet period, Kazakhs occupied a very curious status. They were at once the titular nationality and at the same time actually an ethnic minority. Only in 1999, 8 years after the Soviet collapse, did Kazakhs regain the demographic majority in what is now known as the Republic of Kazakhstan, an independent country. Today, I'll be speaking about this disaster, which is the subject of a book project that I'm working on. I'll provide an overview of the disaster, its major events, and its consequences for Kazakh society. More generally, the Kazakh famine is a topic that is little known in the West. It's almost entirely missing from major scholarly overviews of the Soviet period. And though the disaster has major bearing on how we understand the nature of Stalin's rule, and arguably even the violent course of the 20th century itself, the disaster's major events and causal factors are not well understood. Indeed, as I discuss in an epilogue to my book, the case of the Kazakh famine in fact raises broad questions about why it is that we remember or we forget certain episodes of mass violence, and how it is that this particular episode came to be excluded from our understanding of Stalinism. When it is published, I hope that my book will remedy this gap, becoming one of the first complete accounts of the Kazakh famine in the West. The major thrust of the book, as I see it, is bringing this story, long-neglected story, to light. But it's also to ask how this disaster, once it's reinserted back into our understanding of Soviet history, alters our understanding of Soviet modernization and nation building. In my research, I explore the elements of these two projects, Soviet nation building and Soviet modernity, as they unfolded in Kazakhstan. I probe the frequent tensions that occurred as the Soviets tried to realize these two, at times, contradictory aims. The project of Soviet modernity was, of course, universal, the attempt to make all societies communist, while the project of Soviet nation-making, on the other hand, was particularistic. It held that each nation, whether Kazakhs, Uzbeks, or Ukrainians, had a particular culture, language, territory, and history that needed to be supported and promoted. I argue that the Kazakh famine was the result of Moscow's attempt to make Kazakhs into a modern Soviet nation. Like several other recent works, I challenge the idea that Soviet nation-making was progressive. Rather, I show that this process of nation-making was a very violent one which often served to reinforce, rather than contradict, the regime's aims of economic transformation. I illustrate its participatory nature, showing how many Kazakhs became involved in this violent campaign to transform their own society. But not all of the regime's efforts at nation-building were anticipated. As I'll show in my talk today, the language of nationality was a powerful tool, one which Moscow could not always control as it wished. On the subject of modernity, I try to provide a counterweight to a literature that is focused largely on the Soviet Union's West. Not only were the peoples and cultures of this region quite different, but the physical environment was also distinct, as I'll highlight in my talk today. It is only in places such as Soviet Kazakhstan, I argue, that we can understand the full extent of what Soviet modernization actually was. Here, the distance to modernize, so to speak, this effort to transform not just peasants, but nomads, was greater than in the Soviet Union's West, and the consequences of these attempts would be more dramatic. As I'll illustrate in my talk, collectivization was a policy that was repressive, both in the human toll it exacted, as well as self-defeating. In the aftermath of the famine, the Republic underwent a total economic collapse. My findings are based upon extensive field work in both Russia and in Kazakhstan and in state and in Communist Party archives. It's also based upon some exciting discoveries that I made at the Library of Congress here, and I'll show you some examples. One of the challenges I faced in telling this story is getting at the voices of Kazakhs themselves. As I've hinted, Kazakhs were a nomadic society in this period. They were largely an oral rather than a literary culture, and it's very difficult to find sources written by Kazakhs themselves. The sources about Kazakh life that do exist are largely ethnographic accounts, Communist Party documents. They're settled people's observations of the nomadic world, and thus they have to be read with some caution. Many officials looked at nomadic life through the lens of evolutionary theory. The oral history accounts that I quoted at the beginning come from the volume in the center, Kızıldar Kırgını, Red Terror, a volume that I've actually only ever seen at the Library of Congress. It's pictured in the center. These oral history accounts were actually collected in 1991, right after the Soviet Union collapsed, when survivors of the famine were finally able to talk about the disaster openly. These materials offer a really invaluable insight into the human side of the story, and I'll weave some excerpts from them into my talk today. So, turning to the beginning of my story, what was Kazakhstan as a place and a society like, and how did these conditions lead to famine? So when it was created, the Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan, it was created in 1924. It was a really immense territory. All of these parts had been under Russian imperial rule, but they'd never before been ruled as a unified whole. It bordered several other Soviet republics, and it also had a large border with China, as you can see from the map. It was enormous. Kazakhstan was approximately, and still is, the size of continental Europe, or to use another measurement, 4 times the size of the state of Texas. It had a sharp continental climate with hot summers and very cold winters. It was very arid and also prone to drought. As you can see from the map, the yellow areas are where the steppe is classified as desert or semi-desert. So that's really much of the republic. And there's more fertile zones in the north and in the southeast. The climate in the central area, which is nicknamed the Hungry Steppe, where I take the title of my talk, is a vast plateau, and the climate there was particularly prone to drought. Not only was the amount of rainfall low, but rainfall patterns in the Kazakh steppe were more unstable than in the steppes in European Russia. There was a great deal of volatility from year to year, and a good rainfall year could be followed by a poor rainfall year. Kazakhs' practice of pastoral nomadism was an adaptation to these features, the distinctive features of the steppe, particularly the lack of good pasture land and water. As pastoral nomads, and I'll show you some examples, they carried out seasonal migrations along predefined routes to pasture their animal herds. And here you get a sense, and in these other photos, you get a sense of the isolation of the landscape, how important animals are to their everyday existence. You can see the yurts, the mobile dwellings, which are actually made out of animal products. These migratory encampments are referred to, a migratory encampment is referred to as an aul. And another example of nomadic life from this period. But pastoral nomadism, as I'll stress, it's not just an economic strategy, a way of using the steppe's scarce resources. It's also a crucial source of identity. Historically, when a Kazakh sedentarized and abandoned nomadic life, he was no longer seen as Kazakh. So, in the late 19th century, the Kazakh steppe comes under Russian imperial rule. Over 1 million settlers from European Russia settled the Kazakh steppe. They settle more fertile regions, particularly in the north. Their arrival makes the Kazakh steppe into a multi-ethnic society, but it also provokes important changes in nomadic life, changes to Kazakhs' diet and to their migration routes. I explore these changes in greater detail in my book, showing how the legacies of Russian imperial rule became a contributing factor, actually, in the famine itself. By the onset of Soviet rule, Kazakhs are the largest group of nomads in the Soviet Union. They constitute about 80% of the total. And for the vast majority of Kazakhs, being Kazakh is still very closely intertwined with being a nomad. The term Kazakh we might think of actually as a type of mixed social and ethnic category, one which denotes a way of life, but also pastoral nomadism, but also an ethnicity. In the initial years of Soviet rule, the period 21 to 1928, Moscow took a contradictory approach to ruling the republic. Some programs worked to undermine pastoralism, while other programs actually worked to support it. In general, party experts and bureaucrats really struggled to understand what approach they should take. This was a landscape and a population that did not have clear parallels in the categories that party members brought with them from European Russia. Karl Marx, for instance, had predicted that socialist revolutions might occur among workers. Lenin then radically modifies Marx's ideas, and he predicts that a socialist-style revolution might occur amongst peasants. But neither of the two men had given much thought to how and if a socialist-style revolution might occur amongst an entirely different social group, pastoral nomads. Party experts began to ponder a series of questions. Did nomads actually have classes in the same way that settled societies did? And if so, how did these classes function? Economically, could pastoral nomads speed through the Marxist-Leninist timeline of history and be transformed into productive factory workers? Indeed, the seeming absurdity of bringing a socialist-style revolution to this republic, dotted with nomads, led one prominent Kazakh cadre, Sultanbek Khojanov, you can see him here, to circulate a joke. You can't get to socialism by camel. At the heart of Khojanov's joke was a question, which party experts themselves tried to resolve in this period. Could you get to socialism by camel? I.e., was nomadism backwards, or was it in fact a modern way of life, something compatible with socialism? Entangled, of course, with all of these questions was the question of the issue of the republic's environment. Could a specifically socialist state overcome the difficulties that Kazakhstan's arid landscape, which was so different from Western Europe, seemed to place on human activity? Or rather, was nomadism the only possible use of the landscape in particularly arid areas of the republic? Indeed, many party experts associated with the Republic's Commissariat of Agriculture concurred that nomadism was the most productive use of the Kazakh steppe. One ethnographer and party expert, Sergei Shvetsov, went so far as to warn of the extreme dangers of nomadic settlement. Shvetsov, who had been allied with the right faction of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, said, quote, "The destruction of the nomadic way of life in Kazakhstan would represent not only the death of steppe livestock raising and the Kazakh economy, but the transformation of the dry steppe into an unpopulated desert," unquote. But by 1928, the tenor of these discussions in Kazakhstan and across the Soviet Union more generally began to shift. A severe shortage of grain across the Soviet Union triggers a shift in policy. This leads Stalin to introduce the first five-year plan, this radical modernization scheme that I mentioned at the outset. Experts such as Shvetsov became vulnerable both for their non-Bolshevik background, as I mentioned, and for their ideas, and he is denounced. A separate group of experts now belittle the assertion that the Kazakh steppe's environment places certain limits on human activity. They argue that under socialism, swamps might be emptied, entire deserts irrigated, and even the lowest quality soil brought under cultivation. Settled life, rather than pastoralism, they argue, is the most productive use of the landscape. They argue that settling the Kazakhs is going to lead to dramatic gains in the republic's productivity, freeing up resources such as land, labor, and livestock. The language of Soviet nationalities policy, which sought to consolidate groups such as the Kazakhs into modern socialist nations, served to further legitimize and reinforce the importance of this shift to settled life. Experts declare nomadism to be incompatible with the development of so-called contemporary culture, such as schools, hospitals, and telegraph connections. Leading party members declare that Kazakh's national development, what they euphemistically refer to as the reconstruction of the aul, or nomadic encampment, is not in opposition to the republic's economic development, but as they phrased it, one flows from the other. Thus, the language of Soviet nationalities policy serves to reinforce the party's war on a social category, nomad. As we will see, the category of Kazakh and the category of nomad served overlapping and mutually reinforcing goals for the party's assault on nomadic life. In 1928, the party's war on nomadic life began, and it would escalate by the winter of 1929 to 1930 with collectivization. This assault was led by Kazakhstan's leader and party secretary, a man named Filip Goloshokin. You can see him here. Goloshokin himself is actually someone who had originally been trained as a dentist, but then picked up another career making a revolution. He joins the Bolsheviks early, prior to 1917. He goes on to gain fame for his revolutionary zeal and toughness, and he's actually renowned in Bolshevik circles. He plays a role in the murder of the Tsar's family. Later on in 1933, this is getting a little bit ahead of the story, but he's removed from his position. He's actually scapegoated with causing the Kazakh famine at the time. Famine today in Kazakhstan is often still referred to as Goloshokin's genocide. As you can see, and you might guess from his death dates, he's actually executed, like many others who had old Bolshevik ties, in 41 as part of the party purges. With the launch of collectivization in 1929, Moscow declares the onset of a program entitled Sedentarization on the basis of full collectivization. This meant that nomads are going to be sped through the Marxist-Leninist timeline of history, that they would be sedentarized and also collectivized simultaneously. It was underpinned by the idea that you needed extraordinary speed to help the Kazakhs catch up to more advanced peoples. So I'm sure you have never seen a photograph of a camel hooked up to a plow before, but there you go. Like depeasantization, its corollary in the Soviet Union's West, nomadic settlement was an attack on the cultural identities and economic practices of this particular social group. Activists began to collectivize nomadic regions. They levied dizzying grain and meat procurements. At times, they used the republic's environment to exact maximum damage, actually. They settled Kazakhs in areas of the republic that had no water or were particularly susceptible to drought. The Republic's party committee begins to pursue also denomadization through other routes, criminalizing a range of practices essential to the maintenance of nomadic life, such as Kazakh slaughter of animals during the wintertime, or their ability to migrate across seasonal borders. Efforts at local level implementation hinge heavily on Moscow's partnership with local cadres, many of whom are Kazakh. As I discuss in greater detail in my book, the promotion of native cadres actually forms a crucial element of this nation-building policy. The upper ranks of the party and state bureaucracy are largely filled with bureaucrats from European Russia, some of them like Goloshokin, but the lower ranks of the bureaucracy are primarily Kazakh. And in a strategy purposely designed to shatter old allegiances and sow violent conflict, Moscow actually empowers Kazakhs themselves to make some of the most crucial choices, such as who would be considered an exploiter and how much grain to confiscate from them. And as I found in my research, the efforts of these local cadres were actually crucial. They often shaped the scale of the violence, its intensity, but also its character, including which groups won out and which groups lost. Ultimately, the results of this assault, this campaign of denomadization, were both anticipated and unanticipated. In the winter of 1930, famine began. In Kazakhstan, like in other places, Moscow anticipated that this offensive would result in considerable loss of life. And this was seen as a necessary byproduct of this effort to incorporate the region. But Moscow did not anticipate the scale of the famine, and a number of unintended consequences soon emerged. Animal numbers begin to plummet rapidly as the party struggles to develop a form of animal husbandry to take pastoral nomadism's place. Animals that are socialized in large pens for the first time, they begin to contract various diseases and they perish. Muhammad Shayakhmetov, a famine survivor, recalled, quote, "An eerie silence hung over the aul. There was no mooing, bleating, or neighing." As the situation inside Kazakhstan became increasingly desperate, many nomads entered into flight. This was a strategy that nomads often used when political conditions became difficult or when environmental conditions changed, and they use it again now during the famine. With their herd numbers in ruins, those who remained behind faced an almost certain death. Zayten Akishev, who worked as a teacher in the outskirts of Semipalatinsk, a city in the republic's north, remembered touring abandoned settlements on the city's outskirts. Most were empty, but in one hut he found two skeletons intertwined, two lovers trapped in an embrace. The republic itself in this period begins to empty out. Ultimately, more than 20% of the republic's population would actually flee Kazakhstan. That's over 1 million people. This created a regional crisis of unprecedented proportions. And here you can see some people fleeing the famine. My guess is actually their first wave refugees. You can see they're actually dressed a little bit better than most of the descriptions of the refugees I encounter in my documents. Moscow framed this tremendous human suffering as a sign of success and progress. Kazakh refugees were referred to as otkachevniki, and literally that term means, this is an invented term, it means nomads who are moving away. And their appearance was actually depicted as part of a necessary transition in Kazakh's development into a socialist nation. This transitional stage demanded extra vigilance, officials warned, and the party intensified its assault on nomadism, declaring fantastical plans to settle the Kazakhs even more quickly than before. In neighboring Soviet republics where starving Kazakhs fled, the tensions between Soviet nationalities policy and Soviet economic policy come into sharp relief. Waves of violence broke out as locals seek to expel so-called foreign Kazakhs from their republics, such as Uzbekistan and Russia. And this was particularly striking given that the division of these republics into national territories had been imposed by Moscow on this region just a few years before. Kazakhs in neighboring republics were often lynched or beaten. In Russia, activists round up Kazakhs in rail cars and send them back to Kazakhstan, dumping them just across the border. As the crisis inside the republic deepened, Moscow tried to institute proposals to settle Kazakhs actually where they fled, in these neighboring republics. But officials in these republics harnessed the language of nationality to object. They protested that proposals to settle Kazakhs where they fled represented a violation of their republic's so-called national rights. Inside the republic, a desperate struggle for survival continued. Muhammad Shayakhmetov, the famine survivor, remembered, "Everyone, was now preoccupied by getting something to eat for the following day, or that same day, or that very moment to relieve their hunger pangs. Even the kindest-hearted people and closest friends and relatives could no longer help one another out. Along the Republic's railway lines, travelers encountered scenes of horror. They reported seeing living skeletons with tiny child skeletons in their hands begging for food. Many people turned to substitute foods to survive. Famine survivors remember eating wild grasses or combing through fields to collect the rotting remains of the harvest. Others turned to cannibalism. One of the most pressing problems became the burial of the dead. When activists had the strength to do it, corpses are dumped on the outskirts of cities. And for those who survived the famine, seeing loved ones buried in this famine was deeply traumatic. These mass burials violated Muslim tradition, which called for the faces of the dead to be wrapped in cloth and their bodies turned towards Mecca before burial. Remembering the desperation of the famine's final phase, Dusan Asabayev, a famine survivor, wrote, "Suffering was not leaving our heads, our eyes were full of tears." Ultimately, Moscow would finally succeed in bringing the famine to an end in 1934. Due to the death of more than 90% of the Republic's livestock herds, pastoral nomadism as a way of life had been all but extinguished. Moscow had succeeded in doing this, and this would trigger a profound transformation of Kazakh identity. More than 1.5 million people had perished, as I mentioned. Though Kazakhstan was a multi-ethnic society, the burden of this suffering fell disproportionately on Kazakhs. They constitute actually 1.3 million of this death toll of 1.5 million. It's clear that the regime's broader goal was to transform Kazakhs and Kazakhstan radically, with little regard for the tremendous loss of life incurred in the process. Moscow's policies, for instance, anticipate the cultural destruction of Kazakh societies. But I do not find any evidence to indicate that these plans for a violent transformation of Kazakhstan ever became transformed into a desire to eliminate Kazakhs as a group. But it's clear also that the regime could not transform Kazakh society as it wished. Some features of Kazakhs' pastoral nomadic way of life, such as their reliance on kinship, actually survived the famine. Though the party had sought to consolidate Kazakh society into a nation defined by territory, as I mentioned, large numbers, over 1 million Kazakhs, are displaced outside of the republic during the famine. Many of them never returned to Kazakhstan, and this profoundly reshapes the demographic and the ethnic balance of the broader region. And while the regime actually sought to carry out Soviet-style modernization, they had actually engineered the republic's total collapse, economic collapse. Though the republic had previously been Moscow and Leningrad's major meat supplier, some 90% of the republic's animal herds, as I mentioned, perished in this disaster. It would take more than 2 decades for them to bring the republic's livestock numbers to reach their pre-famine levels. Due to the lack of work animals in the republic in the disaster's aftermath, collective farmers now were forced actually to sow the fields by hand. Officials are even forced to purchase livestock from China to build up the republic's livestock base. To conclude my talk, I'd like to return to the questions of Soviet modernization and nation building, 2 issues that I raised at the beginning. On the subject of Soviet modernization, we see that the challenges of transforming this region were distinct. And I've called along the way in my talk, I've called particular attention to the issues that they faced in transforming the republic's arid environment, which differed sharply from the landscapes of European Russia. Ultimately, the issue of transforming the landscape continues to bedevil the regime, and we can see echoes of it, for instance, in later periods, such as the attempt to transform the Kazakh steppe under the Virgin Lands program through Khrushchev. But on the subject of Soviet development, I've also stressed the extent to which the project of collectivization in Kazakhstan was a failure. These policies were cruel, but they were also counterproductive. They were repressive, but they were also self-defeating. Soviet modernization was supposed to build a stronger state, but in reality, it would take the republic several decades to recover from this economic devastation. As I've shown, the language of Soviet nation building often served to reinforce, rather than contradict, the regime's goals of Soviet economic transformation. Categories such as Kazakh and nomad were not necessarily in opposition to each other, but they might serve mutually reinforcing goals. This helps us shed new light on how to understand the devastating toll of the Soviet collectivization famines, which, as I previously mentioned, hit a broad swath of the Soviet Union, but in particular, Ukraine and the Volga, Don, and Kuban areas. Previously, much of the scholarship on collectivization, these famines, has been highly contested, and it's been divided into two schools, and the case of the Kazakh famine has been largely left out. The first school raises the issue of nationality. They argue that this is the moment in collectivization when the regime abandoned its commitment to the promotion of nationality and carried out an orchestrated attack against Ukrainians as a national group. Alternately, others have taken a different view. They've argued that the Ukrainian famine was part of a broader assault by the regime against a social category, peasants. In Ukraine, like in Kazakhstan, a national and a social category actually overlap. Most Ukrainians are peasants. And to bolster their claims, these scholars point to the existence of famine amongst the peasantry in other parts of the Soviet Union, such as the Don, Kuban, and Volga areas of Russia. But my research shows, and more broadly, I think the reinsertion of the Kazakh famine into this debate, that neither the explanation of nationality or peasantry holds. As the case of the Kazakh famine and the party's denomadization campaign reveals, collectivization was an assault actually on social categories more broadly, not just an assault on peasants. The categories of national and social were not necessarily in opposition to each other or mutually exclusive, as this debate might imply, but they often served mutually reinforcing aims. While many scholars imply that the regime's treatment of Ukrainians was unique, my work shows that there was a far broader swath of terror in this period. Many of the brutal tactics used in Ukraine, such as the closure of borders so that the starving peasants could not flee, were actually used first in Kazakhstan. Ultimately, my research reveals the centrality of the project of nation building to the Soviet project. In Kazakhstan, we most clearly see, I think, the Soviets' mobilizational aims, the extraordinary efforts that they took to form a group of nomads into a nation. But the unresolved tensions between the project of Soviet modernity and Soviet nation-making were unresolved, and they would continue to plague the Soviet Union up through the collapse. Thank you. I look forward to your questions. I'm just getting a pen to take notes. Yeah, Anya.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to talk about a subject about which I knew virtually nothing.
No one does, don't worry.
Very much that, but that's precisely what my question gets at. I mean, you mentioned these oral accounts that you found.
Yeah.
This memory of famine, this sort of silence throughout the Soviet years. Can you say a little bit about, I mean, there must have been some sort of oral tradition of this passing it on, but you also mentioned that obviously so many Kazakhs were in exile. So could you sort of talk a little bit about sort of where this memory lived, how it was actually shaped, transformed, passed on, and so forth, which means this is the early 30s and then the early 90s, which seems to be when some of these interviews
Yeah.
and are there efforts, for instance, by exiles, by to sort of preserve some of these stories, to sort of shed light on this forgotten chapter? How do you ever really find, I think, examples of the sort of complete silence? I mean, there must have been,
I think the whole question of the memory of the Kazakh famine, it's a really, really interesting topic. And whenever I speak, I encourage someone else to go out and write a book on it because I make some stabs at trying to say something about it, but it's actually a really important and very interesting topic. So yes, as far as I've been able to determine, memories of the famine are preserved orally. It also, for the 30s through up until the collapse, you couldn't really talk about this subject, but I found actually examples of it woven, for instance, into Kazakh literature. That's one way that it appears in Kazakh language literary journals in this period. But I haven't done the research or found much evidence beyond that. That is sort of my only instance of it appearing from the 30s to the 90s. In the 1990s, what is quite interesting, and here the for instance, the memory of the Kazakh famine has taken a completely different track than, say, the memory of the Ukrainian famine, which has really kind of assumed a central role in the making of Ukrainian identity. So in the early 1990s, the Kazakh famine is, quote unquote, discovered, and it is talked about all over scholarly and popular media. It's actually even ruled a genocide by people in Kazakhstan. There's a government commission that looks into it. And often some of that literature at the time also takes a kind of nastier edge. Goloshokin, who I highlighted in my talk, is Jewish. This is repeated again and again. It's Goloshokin's genocide, and there are some very good scholarly accounts, but some others take a kind of either implicitly or explicitly anti-Semitic tone. Then, the other interesting thing is that after this explosion of interest in it, the topic begins to die down. And that has more or less, with some exceptions, remained the state up until today. Even when I was researching this in Kazakhstan, I had a couple of people come up to me. They said, great, it's great you're telling that story to an American audience, but we've solved that. I was really struck by this, and I couldn't, I began to probe further, and I talked to some Kazakh scholars about it, and I think there's probably a couple explanations for it. One is, of course, Kazakhstan's close relationship with Russia. There is a fear by bringing up this topic that they might hurt their relationship with Russia or hurt the relationship with Kazakhstan's large ethnic Russian population. Another explanation for the topic, I think, is, I've had talked with some Kazakh scholars who have said, look, we were nomads before. Now we are a modern society. And so I think in Kazakhstan, what you see to a certain extent is kind of a greater ambivalence about what Soviet modernization actually meant and what it brought to Kazakhstan. But it's very complicated. It's a complicated issue, and someone needs to write a book on it, I would say. Yes?
So this is possibly this is also enough tied to the question of memory that it should be a chapter in this book that someone should write. But you talked about the fact that the lower level bureaucrats tend to be ethnically Kazakh.
Yeah.
How are they thought about? Well, the comparison I'm making in my head is, the Warsaw Ghetto and some of the different ghettos where you have Jewish committees administering the ghetto and being the people communicating with the Nazi regime. And there's this constant question, right? Collusion or protecting the population, and how that is discussed in the memory.
Not very much, I would say. I think that is also, like any difficult topic, and, returning to your question too, I think that's, famines are complicated, right? The whole notion of kind of a victim or a perpetrator is really difficult when you're talking about a famine and talking about survival in this period. So there's a certain willingness to, there were some Kazakhs who were in the upper levels of the bureaucracy, much less though than those from European Russia, and there's a certain willingness to say, look, these guys didn't do a good thing, so some of them have sort of been identified and talked about. But on the lower level, I think that is still not very much recognized or discussed. Another point that your questions too brings up is that Kazakhstan, to this day, there's sort of, it's a big country territorially, but it's also a small country, and that networks and circles are often intertangled. And I've heard things said like, oh, I was reading an archival document, and I saw that guy did something bad to someone else, that Kazakh did something bad to someone else, but, I know his uncle, so, I don't think I want to write about that. So I think that the sort of the tiniestness of sort of the elite may also play a role into this as well.
Is there a sense in which those sort of people who had some bureaucratic power, are they able to shield their most immediate kinship networks from the effects of dislocation? Yeah,
some of them are. So I definitely see this in the documents, and this is an interesting Because the party itself, for instance, one of the goals of this campaign against nomadism was they wanted to eliminate markers such as kinship. But in actuality, I certainly on the ground see it playing a role that people alternately, they tried to, shield, like for instance, shield some kin members from confiscation, use it to punish members of a rival clan. But you also see some instances too of maybe what I would argue even is belief, right? That belief in the project that they were doing. Yes, Colleen.
Thanks for this interesting talk. I was wondering about these lower-level Kazakh bureaucrats. Were they educated in Moscow, or were they homegrown revolutionaries?
Very few of them. So at least on the local level, most of the Kazakhs probably, maybe they have some kind of Islamic education, but most of them are not literate. And that's the problem that I was sort of referring to in the beginning with sources. But on the higher level, most of those who are serving in the higher levels of the party, they speak Russian. And if only a very, very few of them, I can actually only think of one off the top of my head, Uras Jandosov, who's educated in Moscow. The rest of them, either a few have a traditional confessional education, but some of them are educated in so-called Russo native schools, which were set up by the Russian Empire in the 19th century. So, yeah. Yes?
So thank you so much for this really interesting talk. And I wanted to ask you about your comments toward the end of the talk in the comparison to Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it struck me
I was wondering why I hadn't gotten a question about the Ukrainian famine yet. It's always usually it's like the second or third question.
it's totally out of my area.
Yeah.
I wondered a little bit. I was thinking when you were describing that as the sort of the direction of study to look at empires and colonial powers as where frontiers and colonies serve as kind of laboratories for population control or forms of
Yeah.
state violence or other kinds of sort of rehearsals of the ways that the regimes end up refining their mechanisms of reform or control. I
Yeah.
wonder what sort of the lasting effects, or if you're looking at what some of the lasting effects of the experiments in Kazakhstan would have had for the Soviet Union's operations elsewhere.
This is a very tricky question. It's a really good one. I've had a lot of, I can point to some hints, but I think one of the difficulties also is in tracing the transmission techniques, right? One of the interesting things, for instance, is that if we look at the Ukrainian famine, a lot of scholars of the Ukrainian famine have argued that a lot of these very brutal techniques, such as the closure of borders, the blacklisting of villages, and so on in Ukraine, that these were unique to Ukraine and they were introduced at a certain moment in the fall of 1932 to 33. However, the Kazakh famine begins earlier. A lot of these techniques are introduced in Kazakhstan first. So I cannot, it's hard. I've not been able to trace the transmission, through Moscow, but that itself, I think, is interesting to see that there is a broader kind of spectrum of terror. I mean, I think more broadly, maybe there's also, you might trace it a little bit in terms of personnel as well. So in the early 1920s, actually when Goloshokin first comes along the scene, he's sent to Kazakhstan, but one of the people who's in Kazakhstan with him, who is posted there, is Yezhov, who becomes very famous. Yezhov is sort of his nickname, later becomes the Bloody Dwarf. He's the person, basically the main architect of the Great Terror. And he spends some of his formative years in Kazakhstan. So I think that's another kind of interesting example of that. Yes?
The thing that strikes me, the reason possibly that the famine has not been treated extensively in recent years is not only the anxieties about Russia, but the fact that, as you mentioned, there were a lot of Kazakhs who were connected with implementing it. Kazakhstan seems to have been disproportionately affected in the purges of 36 to 38. I remember going through one of the museums in Almaty, and they had the pictures of all the great traditional Kazakh folk singers, and every single one of them died born in 1869, 1938. In 1938, they all were high mortality that year.
Yeah.
And then, following that, Kazakhstan became the dumping ground for all of the important
Yeah, yeah.
technologies, which is one thing that has led to its multi-ethnic.
Of course, yeah.
It's theoretical. And then we had the politics in the 80s of the Kazakhs versus the Russians in the Communist Party. So all of that history means that perhaps you couldn't use the phenomenon against any strategic good group of enemies, so why should you pay much attention?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree and sort of disagree. I mean, we've seen other examples where states where in actuality these incidences of mass violence are actually quite complicated, but various states have tried to promote a very simplified history of it. So I think that would have been possible to do in the Kazakh case. I wish I had brought it today. I forgot to include it on my list of images. People always like to see it. But when I was there, living in Kazakhstan, I heard that there was a memorial to victims of the famine. I thought, I'm working on this topic. I've got to see it. Where is this memorial? So I went to all the scholars who were working on the Kazakh famine, and I said, where is this memorial? And they were, scratching their heads. Somewhere down in Almaty, I don't remember. And so I spent, several weekends walking around Almaty, hunting in parks, looking for this memorial, which no one seemed to know where it was. And I found it, and it was in a corner of a park. There is a plaque that said this was done, I think, in 1995, a plaque which was sort of covered with weeds and so on, and it said, in this place, a memorial to the victims of the Kazakh famine will be built. So it's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. Actually, I'm from Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
And my grandparents, during this time, they moved from Kazakhstan to Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I think so much for this research, and I know how it's difficult to do research, especially about the former Soviet Union
Yeah.
countries, where there's no data, no information, a lot of stuff is hiding, and a lot of things what you told, it does make sense to me because I'm coming from the culture and I totally understand. And what is interesting is that we don't talk much about famine in Kazakhstan, and we always look at it as, it was in the history,
Mhm.
yes, it was that time, but we kind of forget it. And the reason I was always thinking why we never talk about those issues, and I think it's because a lot of people who work at the government level, like senior people, they have very close relationship with Russia.
Mhm.
They're kind of like anti-Western and against the U.S. and have this mentality as kind of like Russia has. Anyways, I'm not going in that direction. My question is, the research, how long did it take you to do this research? And since Kazakhstan is such a new country, we've been independent only for 35
Mhm.
years, there's so many challenges, so many things that have not been discovered yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did you choose this topic?
Oh, well. So, yeah, interesting question. So, just a comment on your first point. I think, and again, why I stress that I'm not providing by any means a sort of definitive answer in the question of memory. One sort of point I've also thought about is that in thinking about this question in Kazakhstan, one also needs to think that I think many Kazakhs don't adhere to, say, standard Western practices of commemoration, right? I've heard some Kazakhs say to me, if we wanted to commemorate something, we don't put up a monument, right? There's other different practices of commemoration, and I think that may be part of the story. So you're asking as to how I came to the topic and how I was able to research it, or how long so I spent a lot of time in Kazakhstan, maybe, 2 years on and off, and then I've spent too many years researching it, actually. The way I first got into the topic, I think, is I got quite interested in Central Asia. I was doing a PhD in Soviet history, and Kazakhstan, from a pragmatic standpoint, seemed to be a really interesting region to study because it had been so little written about it. about it. And then furthermore, archival access was actually a lot better than some of the other republics like Uzbekistan, in that both the state and the Communist Party archives were open. So, and also I really felt that a lot of people generalized about Central Asia. Most of the books had been written about Uzbekistan. They said Uzbekistan stands for all of Central Asia, whereas, yeah, well, I see your face, right? That in reality, a lot of these republics are quite different from each other, and the divide between, say, nomadic and sedentary peoples is really huge. And so that's what sort of interested me in Kazakhstan. When I went there and I started to learn some Kazakh, I then started looking just at school history textbooks, and I saw, they're all talking about this famine, and I have never even heard of this, right, in my Soviet history textbooks, and it's not even there. So that's what sort of pushed me into it, and I think I was lucky in the end in my topic in that it was also a topic that every Kazakh could understand why it was important for me to explain this to an American audience. So I, just when I was taking like taxi cab rides, taxi cab drivers would tell me stories, right? What are you doing here? And so that, for me, that was also a really interesting part of the topic. Yeah.
Time for one final question.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, you're right.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. Really important topic about which I too knew very little before. I have a couple of interrelated questions. One has to do with a really interesting remark that you touched on during the there is a kind of a saying, in fact, in Kazakh, one ceases to be a nomad, ceases to be a Kazakh.
Yeah.
So I was fascinated by how people in Kazakhstan grapple with the question of national self-definition as a Kazakh in the wake of the loss or large-scale loss of nomadic culture. I can see how losing Kazakh in essence serve assimilation to Soviet project. But how in this post-Soviet Union is Kazakh And then the second question also has to do with the nomadic. I was curious why the Soviet state seems to invest so much of its energies in crushing nobles, particularly. And what was it about nobles and nobles, especially threatening to Soviet project? Given that there are forms of collective life that underpin society, what distinguishes those forms of collectivism you can call them from, say, Soviet collectivism, which obviously it's a statist project.
Yeah.
So also necessary to crush. And I just briefly had in mind James Scott's book, The Art of Not Being Governed.
Yeah.
His point on how people's in really isolated contexts in East Asia. There's sort of targets of state control and state using sort of close their hands and giving them the power of the state. So I was wondering if that kind of piece speaks in a way to your project.
Great, thank you. So the first question about this question of national self-definition, I think that's, it's still very much a question in Kazakhstan. The interesting thing is in Kazakhstan right now, there is an enormous effort to revive Kazakh's nomadic past. In contrast to the sort of standard line that nomads are very backward and this was not an advanced civilization, there's enormous emphasis on reviving the ancient roots of nomadism in Kazakhstan. So they trace the history of Kazakhs. This is a sort of stretch if you ask me, all the way back to the Scythians, and trace the sort of some scholars do, And so there's a lot of attempts to try and stress the roots of nomadic culture in Kazakh society today. For instance, hospitality. This was always seen as something that was, important to a nomadic culture. So there is an attempt actually to, in some way, revive the nomadic past. There's also an increasing interest, for instance, in a lot of Kazakhs. Genealogy is something that's really important to nomads. It's both, an economic tie, something that's really important to nomadism, but also a source of identity and kinship. And there's been a new emphasis on trying to trace one's genealogy. They've constructed genealogical registers, which are very sort of popular to buy. You can learn about your own particular clan and its history. So to a certain extent, yeah, that is being revived. So in terms of your second question, why so much energy to nomadism? Why is it seen as so threatening? Well, I think it's something that I have actually also sort of struggled with, because it is interesting. I've always found it interesting that there was this sort of pro-nomadism strain in the 20s, right, which then disappears. But ultimately, I think nomadism is in conflict with a couple ideas that the Soviets are putting forward. And you also raised the point that these nomadic societies are actually themselves, right, communal collective societies. This is a point raised by Kazakh communists in the 20s. Look, we already have communism. We're already doing everything collectively. So they actually raised, right, they raised that point. Yeah, but I think on the level of, say, nation building, if you have already decided that nations correspond to territories, right? Soviet nations correspond to boundaries. Nomads actually do not adhere to boundaries. They do not adhere to international boundaries, right? There's a huge Kazakh population in Xinjiang. There was, even before the famine, this province of China. And so this is a problem, right? Trying to put in a conception of nationality that is rooted in territory, if you're a nomad. I think another thing is that the idea of the first 5-year plan as it was developed was predicated on actually getting surpluses, right? Collectivization was supposed to produce surpluses of meat and of grain and so on. And nomads, the kind of productive cycles of nomadism do not go in that way, right? This is not something that's going to adhere to this vision of development. So I think that's possibly sort of two answers to your question. Yeah. Okay, thank you all.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for that thorough and thought-provoking presentation. I have one announcement before we disperse, and that's that we'll be back in this space next Friday, October 28. The Kluge Center has a McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History, and next Friday, our past McGuire Chair will be here, and the lecture will be The Economy of Promises, Trust and Credit in America, and that's by Bruce Carruthers from Northwestern University, and it's 3 o'clock on Friday. So we hope to see you then. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.